I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark.
Hi, folks, and welcome to GM Tools Scaling Adventures.
That's right. Today we're going to be talking about how to scale adventures based on a larger group, a smaller group, a group with more players, or... Oh, wait, no, we said that already. A group of higher level or a group of lower level. There we go.
Mm-hmm. Or a group that winds up being mixed, hypothetically, in a system that is not necessarily intended to have a mixed system.
Well, honestly, almost no level-based system does great with mixed groups. The better a system does with mixed groups, it's usually because the system has drastic disparity between characters of the same level based on how optimized you are, and then it works out if you... in the sense that if you really optimize the low-level character, then they're strong anyway, and if you didn't, then it didn't matter that you were lower level, you were already not contributing compared to the people who were just doing the whole fight. So, mixed groups is just not generally a great idea, but and you can't necessarily even scale an adventure for mixed groups. Mixed groups is sort of their own topic, I think.
Okay,
I don't know. What do you think?
I was going to talk about challenge points, which necessarily requires getting into mixed groups a bit.
Well, we should talk about them as the answer to how Pathfinder Society scales things up, but that isn't to say that you should ever try to have mixed groups unless you are literally forced to because you're Pathfinder Society.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, let's go into scaling, and let's start with the question of, well, what game are you playing? Scaling is different in different games. We're generally going to be talking here for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. However, in some ways, Pathfinder 1st Edition and Starfinder share a lot of the same principles of scaling because of the fact that all three of them sort of share the fact that according to the XP of an encounter, two creatures are the same challenge value as a creature that is 2 levels higher than that, than them. So, like, 2 level 2s is the same as a level 4 as an opponent according to the system in all three of those. Now, in Pathfinder 1st Edition, the system was really not very accurate about that. It's impossible to be perfect when you do any of these things. In 2nd Edition, it's closer. It depends on what the group is good at compared to if they're good at area of effects or they're good at using debuffs to take down a single opponent. Different groups would be good at different things. And Starfinder is a little bit in between both of them in that regard. But because all three of them share that DNA that they all, as a system, think that that a creature 2 levels higher is twice as much XP, that means that many of these tips can be used in any of the three. Just most effectively in 2nd Edition. So, let's talk about why or when you need to scale. If you're just running your own homebrew content, you might need to scale because you created something only to find that the group didn't go there initially and then came back later, or came into something way too soon.
Or you might need to scale because you started creating a dungeon or a complex or an adventure that you put together, and then once you saw your party composition and how they were working together and how they were approaching encounters, you found that the party was either substantially stronger or substantially less strong than you expected.
True. Also, you might have planned out the entire dungeon and then, like, 3 people joined the group.
Mm-hmm. You may have people who add, and you may have people who leave your group partway through because of life or whatever else, or people who are interested in joining your group.
So, things can happen, and you first, before deciding how to scale in Homebrew, you should think about exactly how you're setting up the Homebrew world. Is it super sandboxy, and, like, the dragon of Cinderspire Hill is the dragon of Cinderspire Hill, and it's always this exact dragon with these exact same kobold minions of exactly the same level, no matter what the PCs bring to bear against it? If so, okay, maybe you don't need to scale. Maybe the PCs are in for some trouble or an easy fight. But in many cases where you're trying to make an adventure that will excite the players with what they're currently doing right now, that isn't quite as sandboxy as that, you may still want to scale based on how many members are in the party or what level they are, so that they don't get completely busted by whatever they're currently doing in the adventure, or just completely run away with it so that not everyone gets to do their thing.
In today's episode of Linda Asks a Question She Knows She Would already knows how she would answer. But Mark, I have players who would get annoyed if you just said, oh, well, this dragon was level 7 if I fight it now, but if I fight it in a few sessions, it's going to be level 9. What kinds of means can I use to scale a dungeon while retaining a feeling of consistency with the story?
Well, you don't have to tell them that the dragon is level 7 now. They don't know what level the dragon is until the end. There are also in-world ways that enemies could become more powerful, maybe because they decided to put off the fighting the dragon. It was able to perform a ritual of flame and gain a temporary power boost, and it could bring in friends, but as we're about to get to, that's not actually necessarily the best way to scale for your party being higher level, in terms of the way that power and action economy go. So it could work in some situations.
Mm-hmm.
Rico also says, don't tell your player the levels. Yes, that is probably the best way to avoid that.
Yeah.
Because once you've done it, you've boxed yourself in.
But
Did you have any other ideas?
Well, I was gonna talk about sort of that power boost, either in terms of generally them becoming stronger and gaining more levels, being good to keep up the feeling. If you want to have the sense of this is a boss monster area in particular. It's like, this is the big bad guy. It's if you keep the big bad guy at the same level, and then suddenly the big bad guy is like, this is the big bad guy, but also their mooks are about as strong as they are. It really changes the feel of things.
That's true.
But also, sometimes you don't have to scale those things, particularly in a sandboxy adventure. It can be fun to have the situations where sometimes there are things you can trounce because you came back for them later. But that also means then that they're not going to be worth as much XP, and there's not going to be as much treasure there. So it's sort of a balancing act of how often do you want to... I consider it to be somewhat similar to why there are trivial encounters in 2nd edition at all. The idea that sometimes it's fun to curb stomp. So you don't have to always scale.
Right. And I mean, Pathfinder 1st edition used trivial encounters even more often.
Yes.
They just didn't call them trivial encounters. But encounters where you wound up, like, in a room with one thing that was the same level or even lower level than your party, or a bunch of things that were like 6 levels lower or 7 levels lower than you were actually not that uncommon in 1st edition either. So, like Linda said, and first figure out, should you be scaling? Do you want to scale? Often you do, but if you don't, that's fine. Don't scale.
When would you want to scale down? So, like, let's say that the PCs really want to go fight the big bad dragon. When would you make the big bad dragon easier because they decided they wanted to fight it now?
It really depends. If this is a homebrew sandbox where they know the dragon has a certain strength based on the story, it wouldn't make sense to weaken it if it's like, oh yeah, it beat that retired paladin who is so much higher level than us, but we're gonna fight it anyway. Like, in that sense, sometimes the story's cohesiveness requires the pieces to just be defeated. Maybe the dragon takes their stuff and then just throws them out to tell the tales and to be like, tell other adventurers not to come here.
Yeah.
Let them see your shame.
So the PCs might make it all the way to the boss thing that they were not really powerful enough to fight, or perhaps they get stopped along the way by one of the boss's henchmen.
Yep.
And then it's like
who's
beats them up
still
badly,
drastically too high level.
Who's still high level and is a really hard fight, and then they realize, like, oh, this is like boss's henchminion number 7. Maybe we shouldn't be trying to take on the boss right now because boss's henchminion number 7 almost DPK'd us.
Or maybe they see like one little kobold scout at the front of the complex and they decide to ambush that scout before it can go back to the rest of the tribe, and then that scout nearly TPKs them because they're going into a dungeon that's 12 levels too high, or maybe not 12, like 8 levels too high, and so one minion that would usually be encountered in 6 almost killed them by itself.
One thing we've done in Pathfinder Society scenarios, and you can do in other places too, to signal that something is just too high level for you, what are you even doing, is putting in an encounter that is a chase where you are trying to run the heck away from this thing and avoid having it kill you.
Like a giant Tyrannosaurus?
Like a giant T-Rex or some other ones we've had where it's like if it even hits you at all, then you take huge amounts of damage, so it is... it's just like, oh gosh, yes, this is the sense of what's going on here with this creature.
Yep. So, we've talked about not scaling, and we've talked about not scaling in terms of should you scale down.
Mm-hmm.
But now let's assume that you are going to scale.
Yeah.
Because this is the Scaling Adventures episode. So, let's say you decide to scale. You're scaling down because... not a lot of people could make it this week. They don't want you to play their characters when they're not there, or a bunch of people just quit the group, and you don't want to put in a bunch of NPCs. So, and the PCs have no reason to know that the stuff was supposed to be harder. You could just scale it down a little bit.
Or your players are looking for a bit of an easier game, and they want to have more easier encounters. And it seems like they've had a lot of tough things in a row, and they want to take it a little bit more easy.
Right. So you've decided to do that, or you've decided to boost up the encounter because it's happening a while later than you thought, or more players are there, or whatever you're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
So, at that point, think about how does your group diverge from the intended audience for this adventure. At this point, it might not be homebrew anymore. We might be talking about a published adventure too.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you wanted to run a published adventure because you just love the theme of that adventure, but your group is just not even close to the same level of that adventure, or has a huge number of players. So, take a look at how your group is different. In all three of Pathfinder 1st, Pathfinder 2nd, and Starfinder, you can create harder encounters either with the Encounter XP in 2nd edition or the CR encounter level system in the other two that work out to roughly similar places. You can make it harder by either making everything that's in the encounter harder or by making more things be in the encounter. So, and you can make it easier by making everything in the encounter easier or certain things easier, or making fewer things in the encounter.
As a general rule of thumb, if you're trying to scale for more or fewer players, having there be more or fewer things in the encounter respectively is better. And if you're trying to scale for level, having the things in the encounter be higher or lower level based on the level of your PCs is better.
That's absolutely right. If there's a big, giant, dangerous thing that is just hard to hit with your saving throws, and a group of 4, we're going to have some trouble there, but they can do it with teamwork, and then you get a group of 8, so you just increase the power of that big thing. Suddenly, like, almost no attacks will hit. Your spells are not going to land on it. If the creature has an AoE, it might be able to take out all of the PCs, and it's still probably going to work out, but that doesn't mean it's going to work out in a way that's fun. An opponent that 8 people, a single opponent that 8 people have a hard fight beating, means an opponent that can definitely take out, right, like 4 of the PCs. If it doesn't do that, then it didn't do even half as much as what the PCs did during the fight, because there were 8 of them and it took out 4. And having 4 PCs be taken out could easily mean having some of them be killed. It also means that every individual PC, roughly, and some of them will be support, so it's not going to be exactly right, but roughly every individual PC might be doing an 1/8 of the creature's hit points, which when you calculate it out over the course of the fight, that means that it's because they're just missing, and when they do get in hits, there's 8 of them, so it stacks up eventually. That's not necessarily fun, even if it's balanced and will come out to work out.
So, and now this isn't something that you can do to bridge a large number of levels, but there are a few types of scaling that you can put in that are other than just like it's so high level and so you fail. In some cases, you can, for minor adjustments, add some more hit points to the creature to give it a bit more survivability. Or give it some counters to some of the things that PCs might do to completely shut it down. But this is sort of something that I consider to be in the in the 1 level range of scaling, and not something that I would do over the large period. So this is something that you see coming up in.
Or you're talking about having more
Society
characters.
Yeah, like if you have more characters, or even if you have more characters and you don't want to add more things, sometimes you can add strength to a single creature without making its numbers completely overwhelming by giving it more hit points or some other defenses that aren't strictly increasing its numbers.
And even then, that's not a great solution, because the ability of 6 PCs to do something that makes the opponent lose their turn is such that if it's really by itself, it kind of needs those defensive numbers to not just kind of lose to the numbers of PCs. The problem is, it's a double-edged sword. It needs the higher defensive numbers to not just lose to the PCs, not from hit point damage, but from all sorts of other things they can do to it. But if it has those numbers, it's not necessarily fun because so many things fail. It's why you just kind of are in a situation where you have a giant group of PCs. You are not going to be able to have them fight just one thing alone by itself with nothing else. Now, there is a variation on that where...
Yeah, well, this is the kind of thing we've done in Pathfinder Society in situations where we have to present a large number of scaling options, and it really doesn't make sense to have minions in that encounter, but we also don't really want to have to present like 3 different variations of the same creature.
Right, and Pathfinder Society has limitations that you do not have, which make it so that they have to make it easy to scale on 2 axes. For every GM who runs it. You just need to make it work for your group. And Pathfinder Society can't do what I'm about to suggest, which is just like change the encounter in a little bit of a way. Let's say it's the dragon. It can't have any minions. It cannot. Otherwise, you're just going to stamp around and people figured out your name was Rumpelstiltskin and hit your foot on the ground and you're just upset. But there are other things you can do other than just raising all the dragon's numbers, such as have some kind of weird, like, flame hazard that shoots off through the area, or...
complex hazards are a great pseudo-creature to add.
Or maybe the dragon was possessed by a demon that is inside of the dragon's body and is taking an extra turn to, like, cast spells and support the dragon.
Yeah.
But... it's still, there's just one dragon,
but it can go twice. That's the kind of thing I was talking about with, like, more hit points, extra actions, extra defenses that aren't just, like, strictly numbers.
But Pathfinder Society usually can't do that because that's actually really going to change what the encounter is like. Just like, oh, you brought 6 players, now a demon possessed the dragon. And then when people are telling stories about the adventures, like, that dragon was demon possessed. They're like, no, it wasn't. You can't. It's a little harder.
Well, I mean, you can, because it just equally people would say, well, that encounter that had the red cap and also the gremlins. Wait, there weren't any gremlins. It was just a red cap.
Fair enough.
So.
But do you ever do things like that where they get extra turns because of a new plot element, or like the environment of the battlefield significantly changes to the enemy's advantage, or other things to attempt to counteract the PC's
We've done some things to change the environment.
Action economy.
We've done some things to change the environment and to increase defenses and stuff like that. We were a little more in first edition. I suppose we had some other things that were going on with, like, stuff that we put in the 6-player version that we pulled out in the 4-player version.
Right. Because it was default 6 back then.
Yes.
But think of just creative ways, and if you look at the Game Mastery Guide section about dynamic encounters that Linda wrote, then you'll see that some of those sections talk about you don't always need to make a really dynamic, really ridiculous encounter, otherwise it's going to get tiresome that you did. But a lot of the sections talk about, like, the dynamic encounter, the point of it is not even necessarily to make the fight more likely to defeat the PCs, but to distract the PCs from focus firing everything into one target. So a lot of the things in the dynamic encounter can be action sinks that can make essentially make it so that the PCs are, oh, well, the hostages are getting burned. Now you've just added that to the dragon. You didn't give them any more enemies, but you have hostages that are falling into lava. And so, if some of the PCs need to help with that, the ones who are best suited for that, it's sort of like not all the PCs are fighting the dragon, and so anything like that could be a way to take care of it. Huh. So people are saying that the camera is a little bit hazy.
Yeah, I had to move it earlier today to use it for a meeting. I probably got a fingerprint on it.
Did you?
Let's just give it a quick wipe and see if that helps.
All right.
If it works for my glasses, hopefully it should work for the camera.
Let's put it back. All right.
That's not in the same place.
It's not?
But it's
very,
close.
very close.
All right, I see. Yeah. Is that
all
better?
right.
Yeah, you saw our ceiling.
That's right. You saw the ceiling. Oh, Numbat, thanks for gifting a sub to Zukiru.
Thanks.
The easiest thing to do, and Pathfinder 2nd Edition really walks you through this, is to add more enemies to the encounter. And you add an amount of enemies that sort of is proportionate to the number of additional PCs in a way based on the XP scaling of the encounter. So, for example, if the encounter in Pathfinder 2nd Edition is worth 120, and you have half again as many PCs as you expect, then you wind up adding 60 XP of creatures, and it'll work out. Thanks for subscribing, Steven. So, in that regard, Pathfinder 2nd Edition makes it a little easier to add in for larger groups, but it's really not that hard in Starfighter or Pathfinder 1st Edition either. All you have to do is figure out, in those editions, you sort of wind up with the party being effectively a higher level group. You divide the XP in 6 ways, so whatever the XP where those things are adding, you just add 50% more, and then the XP is divided by 6 instead of 4, and it works out the same. You just have to do an extra step of division. So, essentially, if you have 6 party members instead of 4, consider adding 50% more XP worth of challenges by adding in more creatures. And it's not necessarily going to always be, oh, well, there's 2 equally strong creatures and we just add a third of those. You can think of a lot of ways to do it, like Linda was saying before. You can take a boss that was alone and add in minions to add up to the number. That's a great way to engage those extra players. Consider a way to add in something new that's also interestingly synergistic. If they're just minions that are like crappy overall and aren't doing anything important, people might just focus on the boss and then wipe out the minions afterwards.
But if the minions help out the boss in some way, like perhaps the minion is
a bard or a healer.
Is a bard or healer. Perhaps the minion generates some kind of aura of fire that empowers the boss, so you have a reason to go after the minion and not just go after the boss.
Yep. In 1 AP, there are minions that give the boss resistance against all damage based on how many of the minions are still alive, and deflect spells. So that gives you a good reason to kill them, for sure, even though they all die automatically when you kill the boss in that particular encounter. So any kind of setup like that is going to be interesting, since it diverts the PC's resources. It also lets different people shine. The ones who can take out the minions can shine. The ones who are going after the boss can shine. It works out well. Let's see. David says it can be really annoying to the player, though, when the minions are helping out. No, it depends on how well you telegraph it. If there's no reason to suspect that that's going to happen, and then everyone decides, oh, well, whatever, we'll just focus the boss, and then suddenly the minions, out of nowhere, heal the boss back up to full, that's one thing. But if the minions seem like they might almost obviously be capable of healing, maybe they're have holy symbols and look like they're evil priests of some kind.
Or if the enemy side is bantering during the fight, it's like, oh boss, what do I do? Heal me, you fools.
That's right. So then they know, and the PCs can decide where they're going to focus their attention. The point of adding in more things is mostly to entertain a larger group, and just think of what would entertain the group more, and try to add in something that makes the encounter more interesting. For example, when I was running Jade Regent, there's a bunch of Hobgoblin encounters that are like all with fighter rogues. It's got one fighter rogue stat block and one with something else that's very, very similar. It might be all rogue or all fighter. I can't remember. And I added in, for my larger group, I kept everything that was there, and then I would give them an Oracle and a Life Oracle and a Bard. Both of which were focused on dispelling enemy spell effects and putting up things like Good Hope.
In which case, enemy refers to our party.
And enemies would be the PCs here.
Yes.
And suddenly, some of those encounters that I'd seen people on the message board say, well, these could get repetitive, or it's just like wading through. These fighter rogues got a lot more interesting just because there was some support on the enemy side. The PCs would try to get to the support hobgoblins. The hobgoblins would try to protect their support.
And we have the support, like, you have the support, like, way in the back on the, like, up on a cliff on the other side of a wall or something, and so we were using stone shapes to bust holes in the walls so that we could get around and get up to them and attack the enemies from behind and stuff like that.
That's right. And I'm just very used to having a pretty big group because our group is pretty big if everyone shows up. If you have a smaller group, the same goes for a smaller group, really. Except for that smaller groups, as it says in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, for group sizes, and it's true in all three, smaller groups start losing the ability to cover all of the capabilities and complement each other, in addition to, like, more than linearly for their loss once you get much smaller than 4.
So you want to keep an eye out for, like, the big gaps in your group. So if your group just flat out doesn't have anyone who is trained in a particular skill, then make sure that you're not presenting challenges for which that skill is the only way to get past it.
That's right. And check out our small groups episode for more details on that. But the basic TLDR is reduce the opponents, and you may have to reduce it even more than that. For a smaller group, you can reducing the number of enemies can help because they could get overwhelmed by too many enemies. But with a smaller group, if there's a solo opponent for the larger group, de-leveling it is fine. It's a completely different story than the other way around. If you've got a group that only has 2 people, and you're like, well, I could de-level it by 2, and that's around the same XP. Assuming that your group has actually covered its bases and you don't want to do more for a 2-person group, you can de-level by 2. That's okay. It's different from the way that having 8 people and then up-leveling it by 2 cause a problem because of the fact that up-level by 2 is still an encounter that group of 8 can take. It's just not fun for an individual person. Whereas the de-level by 2 boss probably will still be fun for the group of 2 to fight.
And another thing to watch for when scaling down for those groups specifically is it's not just the skills, but also creatures that are pretty bad for your particular group. So, for example, let's say you have a group of 2 and one of them is someone who's, like, completely focused on dealing fire damage. You're going to want to be really careful with your fire-resistant and fire-immune enemies that you throw at that group.
It's basically a group of 1 if one person can only do fire damage.
Yeah, so you want to be, like, those are going to be weaker encounters, or, like, making sure that they're highly telegraphed so the PCs have more ways to prepare for them and stuff like that.
That's right. So, when it comes to a higher or lower level than intended group, that's definitely something that that you did a lot in Kingmaker and Pathfinder 1st Edition, because while it is sandboxy, ultimately we had outleveled things by too much. It's pretty much the inverse of the advice we gave before, in that if you have a group that's 4 levels higher than you're supposed to, according to the XP math, you could multiply all of the opponents by 4 and how many there are. But that's probably not going to work out too great. I mean, it'll be okay, maybe, but one fireball might just knock down everything there. It's just a very different encounter once you've done that, as opposed to leveling up the enemy by 4.
And I want to talk about leveling up by 4, too, because the sort of elite template type stuff is a good, quick, and dirty way to adjust the level by 1. But you don't want to just keep stacking those types of templates on top of each other. First, because, they're sort of rounding some of the aspects of creature building. So when you stack them on top, the rounding like will end up with some numbers way higher than they should be, or in some numbers way lower than they should be. And also just fundamentally the types of things that creatures should be able to do at different levels. Once you start getting more than 1 or 2 levels away, it gets more and more different.
That's right. And the monster building guidelines even tell you this. And the elite template even says, be careful over applying this, because the template overestimates the numerical gap of a level, and in exchange gives no additional abilities to the creature. So it could create a creature, if it was already very number focused and didn't really need abilities, that is too strong, or one that, if it's all about the abilities or the spells that don't go up, is too weak, especially if you multi-apply it over and over again.
Yeah, so you wind up with an NPC that has unbeatable spell DCs at super low level spells that aren't heightened.
That's right.
Or an NPC that has unhittable AC and ridiculous damage and attack bonus, but the only thing it can do is just spam an attack over and over again and has no counters for the types of things PCs are likely to do.
It's like the PCs were level 5 instead of level 1. So this boss that was a spellcaster whose big thing is a heightened to 2 burning hands for 4d6. It still only has that. But the DC is so high, everybody fails and takes 14 damage, which they don't care because they're level 5.
Yeah.
So that can cause some problems, like it says in the book, if you just use the elite template. Same thing with the advanced template in Pathfinder 1st Edition. If you're going to be adjusting by that much in levels, you should do it custom. And the monster creation system helps you out a lot in 2nd Edition and in Starfinder. For that, in Pathfinder 1st Edition, you're a little bit in the Wild West. There's some tables of where the numbers are supposed to be that don't really hold up against PCs, but you could try to use those to adjust. But you're going to have to use bottom-up building, so you'll have to find a way to adjust its con and its hit dice to make it work.
In general, there's a lot of adjustments that you can do by looking at where the creature's numbers fall relative to the expectations, and then when you're scaling it, making it fall in about the same place relative to the expectations for the new level.
Right.
So if its attack bonus is high, then for a level 5, and you need to make it a level 7 creature, giving it sort of an attack bonus that's high for a level 7 creature.
That's right.
So that works for a lot of the numbers. One of the ones that really doesn't work out, there's some things it doesn't work out for, like it's not going to tell you what to do for the spells the creature should have. And it's also not going to tell you what to do for, hit points necessarily, because especially when you start getting into questions of where do hit points come from. I mean, if something has higher hit points, it might be because it has lower AC. If something has lower hit points, it might be because it has certain resistances. So generally with hit points, you'll want to take a closer look at what's exactly going on and how important certain resistances are at that level. Because if an NPC is given lower hit points because it has a resistance that's tough for PCs to get past at low levels, a high-level version of that NPC with that same resistance, maybe it's easy for PCs to get past that resistance, so it shouldn't be worth as much.
Right.
So hit points you really want to take a look at specifically when you're scaling a creature more than a level or 2.
If it doesn't have any, and you can see the rules on resistances and weaknesses and changing hit points in the monster building guidelines, but if it doesn't have any weaknesses or resistances or abnormal AC, which as you can see in the rules for monster building, if the AC is super high, sometimes you can do that by making the hit points low, or if the AC is very low, you give the hit points high. If everything seems like it's standard and there's no reason that it would be different, you can probably just adjust it up and call it good. But otherwise, you may need to think about it a little bit. But honestly, if you get the hit points wrong and they're a little bit too low for your custom monster, it's your home game and they killed it a little more easily. What Linda was talking about is more important for a published adventure if you are trying to figure out, in Pathfinder Society, where they have to scale it always.
It's also important when you're scaling up and it may be too high.
Oh yeah.
Because if you have a monster that has very high defenses and it has,
when in doubt, go lower. If you think that there's something that fishy that might be on with the hit points, and maybe one of two ways. Go with the lower one. The PCs are probably not going to complain that the fight went over a little bit sooner, unless you wind up going so low that it's anticlimactic and they just end the fight immediately before everyone can do their cool thing. when it comes to lowering the level of content, because the PCs are much lower level, but you still want to run that adventure, it's a little harder even still.
Mm-hmm.
Because while Linda gave good caveats about ignoring, about not just doing number boosting and trying to get some other special abilities, like some brute-based monsters can be mostly number boosts when you go up in level. If you mess up, the worst that happens with Air is that it didn't have enough special abilities by quite as much, and it's a little easier. When you go down in level, though, you really have to think about what you're doing, because the monster might have a special ability that is sort of the inverse of what Linda was talking about before, where it's like, oh yeah, the fact that this monster is flying far away and using ranged attacks at us might be fine at high levels when everybody can fly and figure out ways to get up there. But if you de-level that down for a low-level group that has no answer to it, they might just be left on the ground being picked off and killed.
And another big one to keep a look at is not just the things that directly translate to spells, where it's like, yes, well, certainly if I have a level 5 creature that has level 3 spells, then and I de-level it, I don't want to keep it with level 3 spells. But other things to keep in mind are like conditions and other things that it can inflict.
It can give a condition that you can't remove without going back to town.
Exactly.
That's a big change. Because, hey, you're not high enough level to have the right restoration.
So just lowering the DC to resist a certain effect that the PCs now can't really remove on their own isn't going to necessarily be enough. You want to look at lowering that effect, and you also probably want to look at lowering the intensity of the effect. If there's a certain monster that gives clumsy 2, then and you're de-leveling it a lot, maybe it should be clumsy 1, for example, so that it's not quite such an intense debuff.
Also, as the rules for creation for creatures state, high-level creatures just sometimes have an elite in something that has in an ability score that just has not been bought off in another way, because they're just so high level. So when you de-level them, you might need to knock things down even more so, just because, oh wow, I de-leveled this Grim Reaper by 10 levels for some reason. It had some elite stats. Maybe it should not have elite of the 10 levels lower.
And it also shouldn't have like the ridiculous dooming powers of a Grim Reaper if it's 10
and
levels
then
lower.
you die and can't come back to life ability, or the aura of everybody rolls twice and takes the lower, or a bunch of the things that it has. If it was only level 11, they wouldn't really make sense. So you have to pay a lot of attention when you're going down. Whereas if you're going up, you should, like Linda said, give it some new abilities to make it fit its new level. But if you don't, it's not necessarily the end of the world. It'll be a little less fun and interesting than it would be before. Whereas it could be catastrophic to gameplay if you de-level by a ton of levels and don't change the abilities.
In general, for leveling up creatures, I like to think about ways that it can be stronger at the type of general thing that it's doing. Like maybe it had grab before and now it's got improved grab. Or maybe it has abilities that were based on lightning and wind and now it can summon a thunderstorm. Like where it wasn't previously able to do that, or something like that.
Improved grab is a really good example. Think about what your creature's turn is going to be like. This not just in scaling, but in scaling, if you're just using pre-published monsters, they're going to be fine. When you're scaling or homebrewing your monster, think about what its turn is going to be like. A lot of times in, I've seen some really good homebrews already for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I've seen some that sort of are ambitious and have cool things in it, but one of the common ways that some of those fall down a little bit is that they have too many things for the creature to do, and they haven't really necessarily thought about what is the turn going to be like. And sometimes that means you have to give them improved grab because you count up their actions and you realize the kind of thing this creature wants to do, it's not going to be able to do that until the third or fourth turn if it doesn't have a few more actions.
You want to figure out what they do if they have 3 actions, and you also want to figure out what they do if they have fewer than 3 actions to still be useful, because you can't expect that they're always going to have 3 actions.
Yep, there's so many ways especially for spellcasters, to deny that third action to a boss, because a lot of successful saves against big mind affecting effects, it's like, oh, you succeeded, great, you're still stunned 1. No reaction, and you lose your first action.
Yeah.
It's a great effect to have on a success that spellcasters are really good at generating. And so you better be able to do something threatening on 2 actions.
Yeah, and when you're scaling up a monster too, It's also just like how I was saying that. Oh yeah, if you've got these really powerful effects, knock it down a bit. We were talking about that. Sometimes you might find that even when you move the numbers up, particularly when you're scaling something very far, that the effect itself just isn't something that PCs would care about at that level. It's totally okay just to replace an ability with a more powerful thing in the same vein, rather than trying to keep the same exact ability.
DC 92 Fortitude save, or your meals don't taste right.
For an extreme example.
Or on a critical failure, you have complete anosmia.
Yes.
Can't smell anything.
I mean, that actually sucks, but anyway. Not in the scheme of an account.
But, like, in the scheme of, like, this is the big bad.
Yes, exactly.
David says, the scheme that sort of hopes the players produce the enemy's perfect battle.
Yeah, because the players are not going to, produce the perfect case situation for your opponents. So, Thinking about the types of resources that the players are going to have to bear at their level when you're scaling an encounter dramatically, spells as well as the types of feats that they have. And if you're doing this for your home group, you know what kinds of things they have to bring to bear. And, of course, the standard advice of make sure that not everything that you throw at the PCs just counters all of their stuff, because it's not fun not to get to do your stuff. But if the PCs have a certain ability that they have and you know that they have it, leaving that as a glaring weakness in all of your encounters. Like, let's say that your PCs like to fly around and kite things from the sky. Leaving it so that your opponents don't have ways to effectively do range attacks is not going to make for fun encounters, or don't have ways to fly. Mobility is a really important thing at higher levels, for sure, when scaling things.
And also read your group. Some groups like just winning automatically with no challenge. Most groups don't, but some groups do. So if your group does, you can just let them win. You could even throw things that are much easier, like throw trivial encounters as most fights.
You know, it can be fun sometimes when your group hypothetically decides to have a group of range flying characters that are flying around in the inside of a darkness, when they all have dark vision and the darkness is on a rope attached to a stone that they regularly change the elevation of, so that nothing in the entire scenario can possibly figure out where they are to target them, hypothetically.
But it was also good that we never did that again. Ever.
You guys. Well, to be fair, they asked me as the GM, like, we're thinking of doing this. Is this okay, or is this going to ruin your day? And I'm like, I've never seen this before. This is going to be funny.
Wonders in the weave. Everything was an Aspis Consortium member that could not see in the dark. It was not a good day for them.
It was not a good day for them.
So, basically, when it comes to scaling, the advice we've given here is what you should do. So that is to generalize, scale based on the number of creatures if you have more or fewer characters. Although with fewer, you can also lower the level. If you have higher level characters, you should usually tend to scale with higher level creatures. But if they're lower level, you can really do it either way, because you have to be a little more... Oh, wait, no, sorry. The higher level and lower level make higher level and lower level creatures.
Yeah.
More characters make more creatures. Fewer characters, you can do it either way, because you have to be special because there are fewer characters.
Yeah.
That's what it was.
There's another type of adjustment we didn't talk about, which is adjustments to pacing.
That's true.
Because when you have higher level groups, as opposed to... Or when you have larger groups, or higher level groups, when you're scaling, one way you can do it, as opposed to making the creatures, like... Say you have a large group and you have a lot of creatures. You don't have to throw them all out on the battlefield at the same time, because that can sometimes get, like, action economy ridiculous in terms of how long does it take for one turn to go through. But you could have an encounter that then leads into another encounter before the PCs have a chance to rest.
That's true.
So those types of things can build up without having so many things on the battlefield at once. Or conversely, if you have a smaller group, you're more likely to want to spread out encounters more, so that they're not going to combine as much, because combined encounters with less chance to rest is going to be more of a problem for them.
That's a good point. So let's talk now about, with the caveat again, really you probably shouldn't do a mixed group unless you absolutely have to. But if you're in organized play, you absolutely have to, because being a welcoming environment that anyone can come in and play in the game is crucial. So they have to be able to deal with mixed groups. So let's talk a little bit about challenge points and how to do the best you can with mixed groups.
Yeah. So, so for the challenge point system, which was very much a project that Mark and John Compton worked together on for a while to get working. There's a general sense that there's a general point value that's assigned to each PC based on sort of their strength relative to the encounter, so that a PC who is say the right level for the lower subtier is 2 points if they're like the lower level of that subtier, and 3 points if they're the higher level of that subtier. And then when you jump up to the higher subtier, PCs appropriate for the higher subtier, it's 4 points for that lower level in that higher subtier, and it's 6 points, not 5, for that higher level in the higher subtier. Because it's sort of assumed that the PC who is one level higher is kind of 1.5 times stronger.
It goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning. In all 3 of these games, a creature that is 2 levels higher is worth twice as much XP.
Yes.
The challenge points are sort of like the XP the monsters get for fighting the PCs.
Yes, exactly.
So if you have a 1 through 4 adventure, a first level character is worth 2 challenge points, but the third level character is worth 4, twice as much.
Yes.
The second level character is worth 3 challenge points, and the 6th level character is worth 6, twice as much. Now the third is not worth 1.5 times the 2.
Yeah.
It's worth 1 1/3. But that's also how monster XP goes. If you look at them too, it always goes 1.5, 1 1/3, 1.5, 1 1/3, so that it doubles every time, every 2 levels. And the way to make it even split would be times square root of 2 each time, but that would be horrible.
Nobody's gonna.
So it's always times 1.5 and then times 1.33.
Yeah. So it's sort of building it out as if the PCs were an encounter for a mixed encounter for their opponents.
And you might know from Starfinder and Pathfinder First Edition about something called average party level. Let me be clear. If you are scaling in any of these 3 games and you have a multi-level group, you should use something similar to challenge points. You should never, ever use average party level to determine how strong a group is. It can cause a lot of problems, like the ones I've seen in organized play, where you have a group and the group seems like that they're going to be okay. They're a big group and they're going to play the easier adventure, and then suddenly one of their low-level characters leaves and they're forced to play the harder sub-tier of the adventure, even though they are now strictly a weaker group because they lost that lower-level character. Or on the flip side, a group that is easily going to destroy even in the higher sub-tier, but then a couple low-level people join, making them stronger because they have those 2 people, and now they're stuck playing the lower-level adventure. Gets even worse in a home group where levels can spread by more than 3. Like, average party level is never good, and it is never helpful, but when the levels are only off by 3, the amount of harm it can do is limited. In a home group, if you have, like, a level 5 and a level 12 in the same group, and you're making them fight something, or sorry, let's 6 and 12, so it's even number, and you're making them fight something that's as if they were a party of 2 level 9s, that is not what you actually have. Yeah. Or
you really shouldn't have that kind of level split in a group.
Right. Or 3.
And that's part of why like the tiers in Pathfinder Society definitely was like, yes, we definitely need to make sure that they are the same as the Starfinder Society ones. We can't have this split where 1s and 5s are at the same table.
Right.
Because in First Edition, I know, like we often talk about the difference between there are first level characters who are stronger than 5th level characters.
Yeah.
So so it's more okay because you've already got all these other regal factors.
There are first level characters that are stronger than some seekers.
Yeah. Yes, there are. But yeah, I mean, at least in some factors, like their hit points are garbage.
Obviously, so their hit points are lower. But
yes.
The last cannon.
But yeah, what was I saying? Yeah. So like in the challenge points, when we're approaching it on the Pathfinder Society side, we kind of have this phantom number of PCs, which is sort of like the number of the lowest level of PC that's appropriate for that sub tier. So like each time you go up Each time you go up to the next challenge point category, we're looking at, oh, this is the 4-player table, this is the 5-player table, this is the 6-player table. And then when you get up to the 7-player table, and the 7-player table, which maybe is 7 players if you're doing that, and the phantom 8-player table, at that point, we're looking at it, and we're like, this is probably actually a group of higher level PCs. Like, this is going to actually be a group of higher level PCs that's doing this. So that's when we might start to introduce, we're more likely to introduce the boost to the strength of NPCs and things like that. Although we're generally looking for quick and dirty scaling, so we don't necessarily get as precise on that. But if you were looking at a scaling mechanism that where you really only care about one of the levels, then you could be a little more precise there. And that the same thing goes for the higher sub tier, where we sort of have the phantom 4-player, 5-player, 6-player, 7-player, and 8-player versions.
So I didn't quite understand that explanation, but I also know how the system works. Mm-hmm. So I think I can recast this idea about phantoms. Basically, what Linda's getting at there is that because it's a sort of a two-dimensional problem, number of players and levels of players, mm-hmm. and it's not just exactly on each dimension because, well, each of the characters is a different level from each other. What she's saying is there's one number that mm-hmm. kind of corresponds to the whole overall party strength. But once they see that number go past a certain threshold, they sort of know in this range that they're started to be the higher level group.
So in the lower sub-tier, for example, if each PC gives 2 points, challenge points if they're the lower level, and 3 challenge points if they're the higher level, and you see that the party has 16 challenge points, well,
then
they're not the lower level because you don't have 8-person tables.
But they could be, if they could all be second level characters.
Yeah,
they could be a large group of second level characters.
They could be a large group of second level characters.
If it was 1 to 4.
Yeah. They could be a large group of second level characters, or they could be a larger mixed group.
However, the moment it gets above that, then you kind of know. Like, the moment it gets to in the 20s, mm-hmm. it has to be a mixed group that's big or a small group of very high level characters.
And that's why we recently introduced the 16 to 18 challenge points in the lower sub tier as well. Because we're saying, okay, if you have 16 to 18 challenge points and you've got a lot of characters, then you're definitely in that position where you have a lot of weaker characters, versus if you have 4 characters and you're in that 16 to 18 range, then you're definitely that smaller group of more powerful characters, because tables are running into issues with that, where
I know John and I found it as a big overlap area and suggested a possibility of having both of them even in the beginning.
Yeah. And we had initially taken that out to try to simplify things, and then we realized, oh wait, no, that overlap was still there. And that creates an issue. But I think that really helped to illustrate the whole scaling that's appropriate for a lot of characters versus scaling that's appropriate for more powerful characters is not necessarily the same thing.
Joe says he's really not a fan of the 7-player tables.
Me neither.
I know. I personally don't find them that different than 6-player tables. However, I've heard a lot of varying things about whether they are even allowed in the Pathfinder 2nd Edition guide. Every time I hear someone say something, it's different, and I work at Paizo.
That's because we're strongly exploring whether or not they should still be a thing, but there hasn't been an official statement to that regard.
I see. That explains it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've definitely heard, like, a lot of different things that are very, very different, and I never know what is going on.
It also goes back to, and if people are watching this later on YouTube, this may have already been decided, but this also goes back to sort of the challenges we've had with trying to get revisions through with the guide and trying to get, like, all of the stakeholders together for important decisions.
So Joe says getting a share of spotlight is a problem in 7. Arcane says, player interactions are a problem.
Mm-hmm.
I don't disagree, by the way. I'm not trying to go full devil's advocate. I think 7 is too many, but I also think for a Pathfinder Society table, even though I run with 7 in my home group and it's okay, mm-hmm. but I also think 6 is, like, not that different. They're both pretty close, and I've seen people who are like, 6 is just fine. I'll run 6 all the time. It can be the default, but 7 and I walk. And
I like 4 and 5. 6 is pushing it. To me, 7 just kind of tips over that scale where it's 6. I feel like I've kind of struggling to make sure that everyone's engaged, but at 7, like, somebody's going to be left out sometimes, and because I'm a slower GM who likes to get more into the role play, at 7 is really where I start to feel that pressure of, you're really going to have to cut this down, because 6 is just pushing it. So
Joe says that their local game store, Adventures League, always runs 7-player tables and seem to enjoy it. Pathfinder Society seems too crowded at 7. It just depends on what your focus is on. Like, if you're doing an adventure that has lots of combat, and the combats are big enough for the 7 characters, then you can be okay. If you have enough time to finish the combats with that many players on the board. But if you're, like Arcane was saying about player interactions, if you have a lot of situations where people need to get engaged in role-playing separately, it's hard to get them all, or when it's mandated they all get it, like in a say, influence adventure, you'll just have Linda running way past the time.
Yes. Or you'll have situations where the players who are engaged in that will be super engaged in what they're doing, and then get bored by the time you get around to them again. If you're trying to divide out the time fairly, or some players who aren't as interested in that will just completely disengage during the time when not only is it not the thing that they like as much, but also it hasn't been their turn in 40 minutes because you had to go around the entire table for this complex social encounter.
And to double devil's advocate myself, one reason in Pathfinder 2nd Edition to remove the 7-player tables, not even talking about how many people are there and keeping them engaged, is purely to shrink that overlap that we were just talking about, where there's an amount of power in a group based on their challenge points, where it could be a 7-player group of low-level characters or a 4-player group of higher-level characters. Making there be fewer of those overlap situations, because with 7, you actually could have a 21-point group that's entirely made up of level 2 characters. And that's barely below a group of 4 level 3 that are just... Oh, wait a minute. Hold on. That's way above.
Yeah.
It's actually above a group of 5 level 3 characters in challenge points. Miscalc.
I mean, honestly, the challenge point system as it is right now is not really properly designed for 7-player tables. They just exist because properly designing it fully for 7-player tables would make it really complicated.
I think a lot of the assumptions at the beginning when John and I made it was that there weren't, because there were some statements that there weren't going to be, but then in the guide it didn't say there weren't.
Yeah.
So who knows?
It's a really challenging thing because it's like, because there's always that push and pull between making sure that you can seat everyone, and are you going to have people who come for one table, hate their experience, and are driven away.
Yep. And whenever you have a 7-player table, in theory, if any one of those 7 players can run a quest or something, an evergreen, you could have 2 with 3 in a pre-gen.
And that's sort of the distinction between 6 and 7, in part in my mind, is that at 7, you could divide into 2 tables, where at 6 you can't.
Right. All right.
Well, that was a bit of a diversion here.
It was, but it's sort of also about scaling. And you said you wanted to talk about challenge points.
I did.
So we did.
No, I mean the going into 7 players as much.
Oh yeah. Well, it's just our chat just really started talking about 7-player tables while we were doing that.
And by the time this is on YouTube, this conversation might be obsoleted. Who knows?
It might be. Who knows? So I think we've now covered even these advanced techniques about handling groups that are all different levels from each other. Just one more side note on that.
Just one more thing.
Yes, just one more thing. One more side note on that is be careful when you have these mixed groups, and always you should try to make some places for spotlight to shine on each character, but try to make sure, since if you're running it a home game and you can do whatever you want and it's not Pathfinder Society, that there's something that's really in the wheelhouse of the lower level character. Also, you're running a home game. Please consider not making them different levels.
Yeah.
But if they're going to be, and one of them's like the low level character is an investigator, you can put in some mysteries or something that they're really good at, so that they can have a place to specifically shine and do well, because combat is not going to be the place for them.
And speaking as a player who thought she appreciated, XP is really based on what you've gone through, and like so maybe if you miss a session you're a little bit behind, but like you're not going to be that behind, particularly as you get to higher levels. So it's really about the risk that you put your character through, and like I sort of thought of it like that, and then we've moved to everybody's the same level, and it's just one less piece of paperwork to track, and I don't miss it in the least. I mean, I know one anecdote is certainly not everyone's experience. But.
We definitely used to. I have a spreadsheet for Jade Regent.
Yeah, it's super
that
complicated.
Auto calculates the XP for each character individually based on where they were at, side role playing things that they did with NPCs, and so on. And
there were incentives to do all sorts of these side things based on XP to try to enrich the story, but like
it's so much simpler.
It was not worth the time. Like you can do those sorts of things without it, and I think that too, like just using milestone XP, like once you get to a certain point, you can use milestone XP once you get to a certain point. You the PCs level after they defeat this major challenge, or you can just have a track of XP for the entire party that is the party's XP that they're working toward, and everybody, regardless of whether they're there for that session, has that as their XP total.
Right.
So those are sort of two ways to do it without the differential one, both of which I think work a lot better than individually tracked XP, which I do not miss.
That's right, and that's also sort of the reason why you don't that, and division is like an annoying step, that you don't divide the XP in Pathfinder 2nd Edition.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so
and you can one thing you can do when you're looking at that too, if you're looking at your adventure and you want to decide like about how much is appropriate for them to level, you can do sort of a rough tally of how many encounters there are. And have roughly a tally of like how many encounters there are, and be like, okay, yeah, I want the PCs to get to 4th level after they defeat this boss. They just hit 3rd level now. That means that I want them to fight approximately this many encounters approximately this many hard encounters, approximately this many trivial encounters, approximately this many whatever in that time, and I'll just try to throw about that many in, and I'm not going to worry if it adds up exactly. If you want to make sure that it feels like they're still fighting an appropriate level of encounters to level up.
So, are there any scaling questions that you feel that we've not yet answered for you, that you tuned in and are like, I want to know more about scaling, but they didn't cover this topic? Because I think we've got a lot of the different subgroups of scaling. Meanwhile, it looks like in the chat people are talking about milestone leveling being a great way to do things.
Mm-hmm.
Elftro points out that adding special side quests related to people's background was unbalancing levels, but with milestone, they won't unbalance the levels.
Yeah, because I ended up having to do that a lot in Kingmaker, where I clicked them over to the slow XP track, and still they were super over-leveled, which meant that the AP just got more and more out of hand in terms of how
That's why Linda scaled an Elasmosaurus into 2 advanced Hydrodamons with Styx water in the room.
Weren't there 4 of them?
Oh, 4. Yeah, I think
4
so. I
advanced
made a mistake.
Hydrodamons controlling a lake made
Using
of Styx
control water to make us get hit with Styx water and lose levels automatically.
Yep. But that's how much higher level you were by the time you fought
Rico's wondering if you scale differently, if it's a fish versus a lizard versus dragon. So, actually, Rico,
yes.
you definitely do. So, consider the room. If it's an underwater area and you're scaling the fish, you need to realize that the low-level fish, part of its threat is just that fighting in the water is hard for low-level PCs. It's kind of what we were talking about before. So, if you only scale its numbers up, and it goes many levels higher, and the PCs are like, oh, it's fine, we have plenty of tools to fight in the water, then you're going to not get as good of an encounter as you could have. Whereas a lizard, usually you can scale more easily and more sort of like in a straight way in the fight. When it comes to dragons, consider the fact that dragons are very magical, and so often gain more powerful magic. You might want to scale those based on the age categories of the dragons, or by having minions, or just being clever.
There's a lot of really good advice on that. If you're making your own custom dragons, take a look at the dragons that already exist in the bestiaries, for examples of how those dragons scale by age categories. And if you find that you need a dragon that's kind of at an in-between level, you can certainly look at a hybrid of, like, let's say that you need a dragon that's older than young, but younger than young adult by the CR, or the level. You could definitely pick up, like, some of the higher level abilities, not all.
You need Veshi?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Also, yes, Rico, I knew you were talking about, and Joe, I knew that you were talking about scaling. I just decided to play
scaling for the scales, but that was actually like a really good question.
I decided to play the straight man and pretend that you were talking about whether the encounter would be different.
Yes.
Because I thought I could answer it in that way and trick you into thinking that's what I thought.
It's actually a really legit thing to think about, though, that the environment and type of creature.
Rico says I just did my mark thing.
Your mark thing where you take people way too seriously.
That's right.
And then you give them actual legit advice.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So, if that's it, everybody, then let's say bye to YouTube. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye.